Especially in your case, I mean, you've had a fair amount of detractors in what people have described your work. Are you really not that sensitive to what people have said?
What we used to do at my ensemble, when we got peer reviews, we would cut them up and paste them on the wall, and we thought they were hilariously funny. You see, here was the thing was that I knew what I was doing, but they didn't. So.
Good evening. I'm Edward Sewell, Chair of the Lindy Family Wing for Contemporary Art, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to the MFA and to what is now the 13th season of the Ruth and Carl J. Shapiro Celebrity Lectures, a series that brings outstanding figures in the arts to the MFA to share with us their work and their thoughts. Earlier this year, the New York Times described Philip Glass as a Promethean composer, a creative force to be reckoned with, boldly original, immensely articulate, and simply tireless. Over a career that has extended much of his 78 years, he's composed 10 symphonies, 11 concertos, operas, numerous chamber works, song cycles, collaborations with dance and musical theatre and film. And this year, although I'm sure many of us would argue he's already in the pantheon of cultural heroes, he literally entered the superhero franchise by writing the score for the superhero movie, The Fantastic Four. In short, he is one of the most important and vital composers working today.
So I hope I'm not betraying anything by recounting, you turned to me just before that performance and said you hadn't heard that piece in quite some time. So what kind of sensory memory comes back when you hear a piece of music of yours that you've created, that there is some distance from?
Well, first of all, what's really nice is to hear people singing who weren't even born probably when I wrote it. And they did it so beautifully, so wonderful. I think it's going to be a really beautiful production. Thank you for wherever you are. Thank you, and for the piano playing too. The pianist is playing the part of a string quintet, which is not an easy thing to do, but that was also very beautiful. But I hardly really remember when I wrote it, but I mean, it's been quite a while. But what's funny about this piece is that it takes hold of our imagination in a particular way. It doesn't seem like something written 20 or 30 years ago. It seems like something that could have been done today, I mean, the story actually, it seems a very contemporary story, doesn't it?
Well, it seemed very contemporary when you wrote it.
Yeah.
In fact,
well, that's because of Kafka. You have to remember, these pieces were written over 100 years ago. I just did the trial, and I discovered that it was done in London this year. I think in 2014. It was written in 1914. I mean, the piece was 100 years old.
And then when yours premiered in 2000, Timothy McVeigh had been just executed around the same time.
All that stuff was going on. It's going on. But the funny thing is that at the time he was writing, the First World War hadn't even happened yet. The mood of Europe was very different. It was a feeling of optimism, of an opening. And then suddenly this First World War happened and it shattered everyone's dreams. But these pieces were written before those dreams were shattered. So somehow, where did he get these ideas from? I mean, that's what I'm. They seem so contemporary. They seem so immediate in a way. And when we think this is written 100 years ago, how can that be?
What for you has to really resonate and stir within you to know that you're going to take it on as an opera?
Very often, the stories that end up being operas, I've known them for a long time. I remember reading Kafka in my late teens and early 20s. It never occurred to me that I would write opera someday. I just was reading them. Other works like La Belle La Bête, I think I saw the film of La Belle La Bête of Cocteau. I saw it in 1954, when it was probably only a year or two old. I get around to pieces much later. I mean, it's not that I'm thinking about them all the time, but they somehow, I've lived with the material for a long time. I only began doing these Kafka operas fairly recently, and now I've done, I think I've done 2 or 3 of them. There's this one, and there's the trial, and I'm thinking of other things to do. But what I'm struck by is that the performers are able. It's not just that I was able to engage the material; the performers do too. This is that without that kind of magic happening, I mean, it's not going to be any fun. When I say fun, because this piece fun, you know, it's funny. The funny thing is that this piece has been done so much. Well, I thought when I wrote it, I think it was done here in Boston at the ART maybe some years ago, and I think it was originally written for a company in Seattle. I don't remember the whole history. It was quite a while ago. I thought that it would never survive the first production. I said, no one will ever want to see this piece again. And
why did you think that?
Oh, well, it's so dark. I mean, what could be darker than this piece? And at the end of it, I won't tell you. You have to go and see it. But the funny thing is that it's almost it's done not all the time. I mean, no one's a contemporary opera done all the time. It's done. I would guess 20 or 30 productions of it have happened since then. That means that almost every year someone is doing this piece, and so what's with us that we like that? Why are we so interested in this?
I think
and yet, you know, Kafka himself had a very complicated idea about. He considered his pieces kind of macabre, humorous pieces. It's said that he would read, like the trial. He read it to his friends, and he expected them to laugh. You know, these were considered to be that. We've taken them, being post-existentialists and post-whatever materialists, whatever we are, we've gone to a different place than he was when he wrote them. And yet I'm puzzled by that, because how could you write this without, I mean, that kind of, the relationship of the visitor to the commandant of the penal colony, and he's talking about the good old days. And what are the good old days when people would come and watch executions? I mean, and so where was he coming from? And yet the performers find there's something in it for them. If it did not resonate with them, they wouldn't be able to perform it. Is that fair to say? And so we all participate in this rather dark event, and somehow it ends up being tremendously fun to do and to see it being done. I can't explain it, but I can tell you that people do this piece, and the nuances, the characters, and then the way you say McVeigh and all these people, that it seems to be a part of the world we live in, more than it would have been when it was written.
Well, let me ask you, I want to go back to something you just said, that you didn't think that anybody would enjoy it because it was so dark. And we just heard Edward talk about some of the negative reviews. When you're writing, are you conscious of who's going to be listening in the end?
Not really. No, I don't really do it that way. I said that many of these stories I've known for a long time, like the story of the Gandhi, the Satyagraha. I had been in India. I had no intention of writing a story about Gandhi. I barely knew who he was when I first stumbled across people that knew him and had been with him, and this was in the late 1960s. And then the opera came up 20 years later. Somehow I have a way of tucking these away in my consciousness, and then at a certain time, he said, "Oh, it's time to do this piece." And in this way, when I was, I had known the Kafka for a long time, and at a certain point, I had been writing operas. I've been doing the big ones, and I wanted to do some smaller ones. I wanted to do ones that I had the idea of doing a pocket opera that could be done in a living room. That was my
pocket opera.
Yeah, I call them pocket opera, like pocketbooks. that you could all the scenery, and you could put everything in a suitcase. You could show up with someone had a piano. You had the people that could perform, 2 people. You could do the whole thing. I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but my idea was that going from the big pieces like Ignatin, which was here some time ago, and or Satyagraha or some of the big pieces. The one we're doing in Washington, which I can't be here for this because I have an opera, Appomattox, going on exactly at the same time.
A piece that you're writing about the Civil War and the Civil Rights
Wars
movement.
and Civil Rights all together. But the thing is that there's, and here's a funny thing, Jared. I never really thought of myself as an opera composer. I think I became an opera composer accidentally. I never meant to do it, but now after all these operas, I guess
Do you consider yourself an opera composer now?
I have no choice what to consider. The big ones, there could be a dozen of those, and then maybe of the pocket operas, maybe 5 or 8 of those, and then there's some medium-sized ones that can be done. Many of the Mozart operas were done for very small groups.
Well, why did you do it? And it came very late in life for you.
Well, not so much. I had begun working in the theater when I was 20, but I was writing music for theater productions, and I was involved with experimental theater for a long time. By the time I got around to writing the first opera, I was about 36, 37. So I've been working with. I was a founding member of a theater company, and I worked a lot with experimental theater. So it wasn't so foreign to me. What I was doing for a long time, I had an ensemble that did music, and then I had a theater group, and I did theater. And they never got together until Einstein, with Bob Wilson, we put it together. We made it, and then once I saw it as a possible way of working, then it just began to have a momentum of its own.
Well, I want to ask you about the theater time. You worked with Samuel Beckett in the 60s, and it was at that time that you recognized how music and theater could intersect.
It was very important. That was a very important encounter for me. I was living in Paris at the time. I had a Fulbright, so I was there studying. And we were living, actually I was married at the time with Joanne Nicolaitis, who was a very well-known director now, and at the time we were all fledgling composers and directors and actors, but we began, you have to remember that Beckett was hardly known at that time. I knew the books. I knew almost everything that was in print at the time. And then it turned out he was living in the neighborhood. And we got in touch with him through an intermediary, and he became very interested in our little company. We were much young. We were in our 20s. At that time, he should have been maybe in his 50s. And whenever we asked him if we could do a piece, he said yes. He always said yes. And we were adapting pieces from novels, and he did all kinds of things which his estate would never allow us to do today. Absolutely. We're not allowed to do a lot of those things today. But when he was alive, it was all just, oh yeah, let's do it.
And where did you find that music could enter? I mean,
well, the interesting thing about the Beckett work, and it was similar to other work that was being done in the States with people like William Burroughs or Brian Geissens, and people were starting to work in what we call non-narrative form. In other words, they would tell a story without telling the story. There would be no story to the story. And Beckett was the great master of that. I mean, Waiting for Godot was really, it was hard to tell the story sometimes, and when you didn't know when it was over either. I recently did music for a play of his called Play Without Words, which is really a good piece. Mr. Bresnikov did it, at the New York Theater Workshop about 4 or 5 years ago, and I did the music for it. So I've had this. But what interested me about Beckett was, and the same thing was happening in the world of painting when we were getting into non-figurative painting. So there was, you look at Pollock, it's hard to see a tree or an apple or a house or anything. You're looking at abstract expressionism was a non-figurative art form. And so that my generation of people, I was very closely connected to the art world because I began partly making my living working as a studio assistant because I had no way to make a living.
And who were you a studio assistant for?
Richard Serra,
yeah,
for a long time. But we were friends from our days in Paris together. When he came back to New York, he had a job, he was working for the Castelli Gallery, and I was still moving furniture. Though he was moving furniture before he did that too, so I wasn't the only one that moved furniture. But I got involved with him and a lot of other people. And what I discovered that what we were doing, and I could say we were truly the children of people like Beckett and like Genet and like Céline for that matter. Because I had been living in Paris, I knew about that stuff. But we were looking for a form, a structural form that was not narrative, and what we discovered something very simple that everybody knows it now, which we call a process. So process became a stand-in for story, and it was a way of, and my early works were all done that way. And what helped me with work, because we were working in an experimental theater, which also worked with that, and then our little theater company was very indebted to people like Grotowski and Beckett and the Living Theater and that generation of people. We were working in a non-narrative theater. So I was writing music for that company. Well, I was basically developing the language which would become the language of what you heard. Now, the interesting thing, once I had really become accomplished at not telling a story, then I got interested in writing stories again. And this, of course, is a story. It's a very simple story. It's the last day of this man's life. And but after I had really become quite accomplished at not telling the story with a number of operas, then I began interested in Cocteau, who was a great storyteller, and Shakespeare. And I was writing music for Shakespeare plays, and I began to write not only for the experimental plays, but again, I was working at the Public Theater when Joe Papp was there, and our company was there too. And we were, besides doing experimental work, we began to do Shakespeare. And then we just, it was a very fortunate time to be working because there was a lot of ideas turning up. And we were inventing things and making things happen, but also there was a generation before us that were so creative and so rich, and they were actually quite interested in us.
But you sought that out, I would imagine. I mean, because you've always been involved in these artistic circles, especially when you came back to New York, and as you just mentioned.
And the thing is that even as a student at Juilliard, when I first went to music school, and as a composer, I asked myself a very simple question: who wants this music? And I had to find somebody that wanted it, and I found immediately dance companies that were studying at Juilliard, theater companies who were doing little productions in New Jersey and in different parts of New York. I found people my age, and I discovered that they really wanted music. And I began writing music for theater and for dance, and then my own ensemble became a kind of workshop for ideas, and then that eventually fed into some of the big theater pieces. So we're really talking about what we now call collaborative disciplinary work, which is what it is, where the elements of movement and image and text and music, this like the earth, air, fire, water, those are the 4 elements. That's all there are, as far as I know. Then somebody says, well, what about the audience? And that's a good point. You didn't make it, but it is a good point. And that, in fact, the spectator, which is what Cocteau would refer to, the spectator. Remember, he loved that word. So there is that side to it too. But my involvement with opera really grew out of my involvement with people working in the arts. And I saw myself as, I developed an ability to work with people. And it was a very, I developed a how can I say, almost a work method of working, which is, you want to know what it is? It's very simple.
I do.
It comes down to one word, which is trust. I trusted the people I work with, and I didn't tell them what to do.
How did you work, and how do you work now? Is it always, do you have to be around people to work?
I tend to do that even with film, with some of the film work that I've done, with Godfrey Reggio, the guy who did the Cassi movies. When he began doing movies, I would go with him on the film shoots. I don't know any film composer who ever did that, but I did that regularly.
What did you need to experience in those shoots to be able to write?
I didn't know. I wanted to know what it was about. I didn't know anything about movies, so I wanted to know how he made them. So I wanted to go, and that meant I would go to see how he would show me storyboards, and then we would go to Brazil or whatever it might be, and I would be there when he was shooting. And then eventually, I even began to write music for the cameraman to listen to while he was filming. I mean, we really it got deep. And I got, because I began to question the whole formulaic way that movies are made, where the music comes at the end. It didn't work that way for me. With Godfrey, it could come at the beginning. And I tend to work best with filmmakers when the film is not finished. And I've been able to persuade people to let me work with them while they were still shooting. Sometimes it's been a completely crazy idea for them to do it, but they did it.
But there must be you must see a transformation. You must have seen a transformation there suddenly with the cameraman hearing your music.
Well, it was great. And what about the people who say, and I was in Brazil, and we were at the Serra Pelleira gold mines. It's the beginning of Poa Cassi, that film. And I had learned some Portuguese already, and they said, okay, what are you doing here? And I say, vamos música por esta. We're making music for aqui. And they said, pois já ouvi, can we hear it? And I said, sí. And I would give them this. I'd take the headphones from the cameraman, and they would listen to it. And then they would go back and they would be carrying the dirt up. So the people who were in the movie actually heard the music. And I did that a number of times. That was my favorite thing to do, if I could get someone to play along with it. When Marty Scorsese was doing Kundun, I sent the music to they were shooting in I think in Morocco. You couldn't get into Tibet I can't. He wouldn't be able to get to Tibet today, for that matter. And I would send the music for him to play for the actors while they were shooting.
That must mean you work very quickly.
You got to be fast. And sometimes he would get ahead of me, so he would be on reel 5, and I would be, I hadn't gotten there yet, and he'd call me and say, where's the music for reel 5? I said, and I would be in Europe. I said, Marty, I'm not there. And he said, I need the music. So I had a weekend. I remember going back home and writing a whole piece of music for that reel, and sending it to him. And I said, I don't think this is probably going to work, but I'll give you something to listen to. Actually, it turned out to be the piece that he ended up using. So, with him, he did not do that again. He said he enjoyed it and he liked it, and it became the way we worked on that movie. I did not convert him to any idea that would change the way he worked. He did that on that one occasion.
How do you, I'm picturing you on the film set and writing this music, and I've read your book, and I'm fascinated by how you hear music, which you describe in this book.
Well, I was talking, I work with some of the Hollywood people and some of the New York people. About how where the music.
Is it kind of an image that comes to you?
It's very.
I think the word you used in the book was the sort of audio images.
No, I just actually I look at the picture and I just put the music in.
It's very simple.
I know it, but you know, it wasn't always like that. You have to remember, I started when I was 20,
Yep.
and I started with a piece by Molière called Scapin. I still remember that piece, and I was paid $25 to write the music and record it, and I did, and that was the first time I had to put music to an image, and it was a play, and the director was probably the same age as me. It was a little production in Princeton, actually, at the McCarter Theater. And from that point on, I began finding ways of putting music. What I would do was I would look for the music in the, there are technical ways of doing it too. I discovered, for example, that the music should not always be what you're looking at. Sometimes it would be better if it did something different. And I began to think of it this way, that the image would be in a certain place, and I would be at a certain place. And the distance that I traveled to the picture was the distance between the music and the picture itself. And I even, it occurred to me that that when people listen to it, they're doing exactly the same thing. They're making that journey to the image through the music. And that's what I expect. I find that that's what you do, and that's how I write it, and that's how we listen. If it doesn't make any sense to you, it's because you haven't looked at it long enough, or you know, it's not. It's what John Cage, he wouldn't say what things meant, he would say things were meaningful. Mm. You don't have to know what it means. You just have to know that it means something. You know, Woody Allen I was working with him once on a movie, and he called me up. Actually, his office called me up and said, Mr. Allen's going to call you. And they called me up because they knew that if someone said, this is Woody Allen, I would just hang up the phone. I only get calls from Woody Allen. Nobody does. But he said, okay, he called. He said, I want you to come and look at a movie. And I looked at it, went to see it. And he said, you want to do the music? I said, yeah, I can do this. And he said, okay. I said, and then he said, now what do we do? Because he didn't work with composers. We call it needle dropping. He has records and he puts on. That's what ends up in the movie. And I said, well, now we're going to have a meeting where we're going to spot the movie. He said, what's that? No, this is a real conversation. I said, well, you have to tell me where the music goes. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. I said, well, what are we going to do? He said, just put the music in. I said, well, where do I put it in? He said, put it in where it goes. I love this guy.
And did you get that control in the end? Because he doesn't offer a lot of opportunity, does
he? In the course of later he said, okay, how can I help you? He said, well, just when I bring the music up here, I want you to be there to look at it. I'm not showing it to your picture editor. I'm not going to do that. You got to be here. Because I didn't want to get a second-hand version of what he... And so I would take it up. We did it reel by reel. And sometimes you look at it. Most of the time, he didn't say anything. But one time he said, no, there's no music here. I said, I can run another piece. He said, no, there's no music there. And I said, well, it's really no trouble at all. I'll have another piece for you tomorrow. And he said, no, there's no music there. And I said, oh, okay. So I took the music out. Then a couple weeks later, we were looking at a different reel, and he said, does the music go there? I said, yes, it does. So sometimes he agreed with me, sometimes he didn't. But he was a very interesting guy to work with because he did what I do, which he let me do what I want. When I work with other people, I actually don't tell them what to do. In fact, the opera I'm working on right now is in Washington. It's called Appomattox, and it's about 1865 to 1965, and actually to 2015. It covers 265 years 165 years. And I needed to get a writer to do that, and I didn't get an American. I didn't trust any American to be able to go to that subject without so much baggage. I didn't want the baggage. I wanted somebody else. So I asked Christopher Hampton, who's a Brit, and done a lot of movies, and I've done a couple of films with him, and did an opera with him. And I called him and said, Christopher, would you work with me on an opera about the Civil Wars? He said, oh, I don't know anything about the Civil Wars. And then he called me up 3 months later and said, I know everything now. And he wrote the libretto. And he gave me what I wanted, which was somebody who, it was so fresh, it was so different from what any American would have written. And so that, well, I didn't tell him. I had some ideas about it, and I said, oh, these are, I worked with him in the past, and what I've done sometimes, I'll do what we call a treatment. A treatment is not a fully fleshed out story. It just says in Act 1, Scene 1, this happens, Act 2, Scene 2, this happens, and I would go through mentioning what the scenes might be, and then he would write it. So, but I didn't tell him what to write, and I didn't tell him how to write it, and he did some amazing things. It was a very, very good libretto. I find that, and the same thing with me, I write my best music for films when the film director doesn't tell me what to do. And if they tell me what to do, they kind of take the fun out of it. I mean, why would you want to do that?
I have a problem with authority, too.
What's that?
I have a problem with authority, too.
Is that what it is?
I think so.
Thank you, Jerry. But what I find, on the other hand, it's a different, it's a way of working in which you enter into the workplace with a choreographer, with a writer, with a painter, and you consider them to be equals. And when you say, how do I work? The first thing I do is I pick the group I'm going to work with. And I almost never have the same group in a row. I don't do that. I keep one person kind of like a security blanket.
Well, I was just going to say, so you don't need to be comfortable, but...
I want to be uncomfortable. Being comfortable means I won't get anything done. Haven't you noticed?
Yeah.
Haven't you noticed? I do my best work when I don't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. And if I work with people I don't know and haven't worked with before, there's a pretty good chance that something will happen that I haven't anticipated. If I work with someone, even with Wilson, we've done 6 or 7 big theater works together, but they're separated by 8 or 9 years. During that time, enough time has passed, so I'm not really sure what he's doing anymore. Even people, especially the people I really like, I don't work with them right away. I'm afraid I don't want to get in such a comfortable relationship that it's no longer challenging.
I find so interesting about your biography. I could not stop thinking about this part of you, that it wasn't until you were 41 that you had a full-time job in music, and you had a family, you had young kids that you were tending to, you were a taxi driver, you were a studio assistant, you were a plumber.
Oh, furniture moving. And
furniture moving.
All kinds of things.
I'm reciting these things to you like you didn't know.
This happens to American artists all the time. As you probably have noticed, we don't support the arts in America. We support institutions, which is a great thing. We need to have that. But the National Endowment for the Arts does not give money to artists anymore. It gives money to places who then get the artists to do things. So that we kind of don't, and if you're a kid and you go home and say, how are you doing? Say, well, I'm painting, but no one buys the painting. You know what your dad or mother will say? They'll say, who asked you?
Yeah.
That's what so basically, we consider the artists freelance workers, and we are. And in many ways, I think it's the best way. My Dutch friends who they're supported almost from the day they're out of the conservatory or out of the painting studios. Almost immediately they get supported. They don't have the drive that the people in Mexico might have, or Americans might have, or Spain, or Italy. Not every country does that. I find that the English don't support the artists either. The Italians don't. We definitely don't. But what it means is, now the good thing is that the people who survive that, let's say that form of tutelage, that form of becoming an artist, tend to be very independent and very strong. The difficulty is that we've probably lost untold numbers of talented people who simply didn't have the stamina to go through with it. And that didn't mean that they wouldn't be. So we've probably lost a lot of art.
Well, I wondered that about you.
Had.
What kept you going? I mean, because it was hard.
You know, it wasn't that hard. I was healthy.
But you were driving well, you were healthy, but you were driving all night, and you almost died a couple of times.
I liked it, actually. I like the city. I like seeing. I grew up in Baltimore. I like New York. I got to know the city. I've only recently gotten to the point where I can't find my way around the Bronx anymore. I've forgotten where everything is. But that took. Oh, I haven't driven a cab in almost 40 years. So that's, you know. So, but I didn't think it was that hard. No, you have to understand, Jared, that that was the given. And very early on, I worked with a young group of art administrators. They had a group called Art Services, and they said they would help me they would write applications for me. And we did that for 3 or 4 years and never got any money. And finally, on the 4th year, one of the people that worked with me they said, well, it's time to make the application. He said, do we have to do this? And I said, no, we're not going to get it. Don't do it.
Yeah.
And I never applied for a grant since then. I never got one. I was far better. I feel I was better off. But it's not for everybody. I mean, and you know, these are it works for me. But what worries me are the people, and I knew people that didn't have any support, and people, you wouldn't even hardly know their names. Maybe you would. Someone like Ray Johnson, who started the New York Correspondence School. Do anybody know who he was? Fantastically interesting guy. Or Jack Smith. These people that, they were icons in their day, but they didn't make any money, and they hardly had, you don't know how they even survived. And some of them did not. This is a very, you know, the funny thing about Americans is that we're proud of this. And instead of being ashamed of it, we're proud of it. Yeah. And I feel the same conflict in myself. I'm both ashamed and proud of it at the same time. Yeah. I'm proud of the fact that we have a workplace for artists which is so severe that only someone with tremendous commitment can do it and stamina. At the same time, I'm embarrassed that we have let so much talent be squandered in day jobs and things that people shouldn't have to do. And yet at the same time, among the younger artists, people that are 40 years younger than me, I see the same drive, and I see talent, I see ambition, and I see people who said, well, and they get together, they form companies, they form dance companies and theater companies and music companies, and they become survivors. It's something that we do. We expect that. That's almost like the price of admission. It's a very severe one, actually. And yet, we're not set up to do it in any other way. As far as the National Endowment for the Arts, the best thing we could do, instead of having all these, we have panels of other artists that could win the arts, it'd be far more fair just to have a lottery.
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah, it'll come out to the same thing. Yeah. And in fact, I would have had better chances at a lottery than making an application. And I never got the lottery anyway, but I never got the application. But it's complex because at the same time, the best thing is for the artists not to measure themselves in that way. We measure ourselves by the deep satisfaction and knowledge that the artistic development. I mean, by the time we had met Beckett, he wasn't famous, but he was established. But can you imagine when he was the secretary to James Joyce, you know, for a long while, and what it would have been like one Irishman being the secretary to the other one. But I didn't know him well enough to know any part of that story. But it's not a story that's new to us, and it's something that's been going on for a long time. I don't know. I don't know that there's any easy solution to it. I think it's the way we do things in this country. I mean, I admire it deeply, and I'm also, as I say, I find it also disappointing in a way that we don't have, we have no way of doing it better.
Well, speaking of executioners, my executioner is looming here. Before we turn this over, before we turn this over to audience Q&A, but I want to ask you, finally, before we take the audience questions, about your convictions. And you also talk about having the "I don't care what you think" gene.
Oh,
and
super important.
Super important, and especially in your case. I mean, you've had a fair amount of detractors in what people have described your work. Are you really not that sensitive to what people have said?
What we used to do at my ensemble, when we got peer reviews, we would cut them up and paste them on the wall, and we thought they were hilariously funny. You see, here was the thing was that I knew what I was doing, but they didn't. So it actually there was one writer who, when Bob and I did a piece called Civil Wars, part of it was done up here in Boston, and at the time, a writer whose name you won't even recognize because I'm afraid that if you write about music, you're doomed to obscurity. It's not this whole, but he said that the music was so inconsequential that he refused to review it, so he would review the scenery. I mean, he missed the whole show. Yeah. So our feeling about it was that these were, this kind of, we didn't pay much attention to it. I mean, we had something far better than that. We had audiences. We had people, we had other artists. We had people who were just citizens and civilians, like many people in this room, who would come to shows and would pay money to hear concerts. At the first, there were not very many. I'd say my first audiences would be maybe 20 or 30. After all, there were 60, and then 100 and 200, and, just normal ways that things go.
You had word of mouth. That was before machines.
Well, we helped with word of mouth a little bit. I think I mentioned to you before, you asked me about how I talked. I learned to talk to people because I had no money for advertisements. So I found that every school had a radio program there would be some jackass that would be up all night playing music, right? And I would volunteer to go on the program. I would bring my records and I would play them. I did that in Texas, I did it in New York, I did it in California. Wherever I traveled, I did that. And I got very good at talking to people about music. And I found that when people said, I even got these funny discussions. Someone said, I really like you, but I don't like your music. What should I do? I said, go listen to something else. I said, there's a lot of music out there and it doesn't sound like me. I'm sure you'll find something you like. And I absolutely meant it. I don't expect people automatically to like what I do. And I thought it was I was very touched that he would speak to me that openly about it. And I gave him the honest answer.
All right, well now I think it's our time to turn it over to some audience questions. My work here is done. So we have...
Mine is beginning.
Yours is beginning.
Thank you very much. I too have a question. But first of all, I have an envelope. And this envelope is addressed to Ms. Philip Glass, New York City, New York, it says.
Do you think it'll get there?
I don't know. From what I've heard, that's accurate. And so don't leave without getting this. I understand there's some interesting things in there. The question I have is, reading your book a while back, a month and a half, correct me if I misstated, I think that you said something like the big changes in classical music come in the opera house. So my question is, the big things happen in the opera house. So I guess my question would go back to one of those periods. What happened in classical music that changed the whole scope of classical music in the opera house when Mozart wrote his operas?
For one thing, they became very popular. I'm told, that the magic flute was playing to full houses when he was dying. That's interesting. Now, we have, we're fond of saying that, that movies have taken over that role, but actually not completely. There are a lot of people writing operas these days and a lot of people performing them. Operas by young composers are all over the place, and they're all over the place. What I was interested in, I don't know if you're referring to this, I found the most creative periods were during the times when politically things were at their worst. I remember the 50s. Do you remember the 50s? Okay. This guy does, okay. Okay. It was the McCarthy years. It was a terrifying time. People were being made to tell lies about each other in public. They were losing their jobs. It was every bit as bad as what we're seeing today. Would you say? Would you agree with that? It was truly frightening. And we were just about to start the wars that were going to occupy us for the next 30 or 40 years.
Actually, it touched me. I'm not going to expand on that, but during I was in the Air Force at the time, and it touched me in a very personal way.
What's that?
The McCarthy, the whole McCarthy. He said it touched him in a very personal way.
Well, and myself as well. I mean, I didn't. I wasn't in Vietnam. Friends of mine were. I have a brother-in-law that died from Agent Orange and all that stuff. But the point is that it was a really difficult time, and it was a huge creative explosion was happening in America at that time. In writing, with people like Allen Ginsberg, who turns out now to have been one of the great poets of our time, who was laughed at. People said he wasn't, they would say about him and Carrie, he said, they aren't writers, they're typists. You remember that? And they turned out to have, the people who said that are forgotten, and their work is not forgotten. But the point is that there was film, there was music, there was dance that was going on. There was an explosion. Now, I'm looking at what's going on now, a good 50 years later, and this is politically, it's a circus. I don't have to tell you. We all see the same thing. And right now, I'm seeing people in their 20s and 30s going through a tremendous creative leap. It's fantastic. I love it. I love that I lived long enough to see it twice. You know, once in my 20s, once in my 70s. And I say, oh, that's how it works. It works like that. That somehow, now how do those things connect? I don't know. I'm just telling you, they happen at the same time. There's got to be some causality there. Something that, some despair with public life that would make a young person develop a kind of creativity to form a balance in themselves for what they don't see around them. Is it something like that? But I do believe that we're entering, and I see it in painting, I see it in theater, and I see it in dance. We're entering, and these are very young people not even 30, some are in their 30s, but not that, but it's, I'm not talking about people in their 40s, I'm talking about the younger people. And if you lived in New York, you'd be going to Brooklyn to see theater piece. I don't know where you go here to see it, but I'm sure that it's happening, I'm sure it's happening here somewhere, I don't know.
It is, all over, it's great.
Yeah, and it's fantastic. Now, it's to be truthful, it's much harder for them than for my generation. When I was coming up, so to speak, life was very inexpensive. I could have lunch for 50 cents. My rent was under $100. I could have when I had my first loft that I rented was $150 a month. I mean, that's unheard. Today, the young people they live together in groups of 2s and 3s. I don't know any young people who can afford to have a house of their own. And I had day jobs, they have day jobs too. So what's new? You know, mostly they don't complain about it because it's been going on for a long time. Now these are people who have chosen, for whatever reason, there isn't a way, you can form an alliance with an academic world, that's one way. There's another world which is more a commercial world, that's another way. But for some people, well, they won't. I did do a lot of commercial work at some point, but that was later on. And I got good at it, and I enjoyed it, actually, to be truthful. I did a bunch of Hollywood movies, and I liked it. I liked meeting the composers. I liked seeing how it worked. I had been doing movies at the Godfrey Reggio for years before I did my first commercial movie. But at any rate, but still, for some people, none of those things will be satisfactory. And this is a very, for all the lousy things we see of your, I don't know which programs you have here, but I don't even want to mention the names of the people. I'm not even going to get into that. But for all the garbage that's being passed as civil discourse, and it's not anything close to it, at the same time, there is an integrity and authenticity that people are finding in their lives, which simply puts that aside.
Let's take a couple more questions.
I'm sorry, my answers are too long. I'll make them shorter. It's an interesting question. Thank you.
Listening to you and your life, your first opera in the 80s, Einstein on the Beach. Then you went into maybe your second or third opera, The Voyage, from the Metropolitan Opera, 5 or 6 performances. Had good reviews, poor reviews. Have you ever, I don't know if it's ever been performed afterwards, but have you ever thought of rewriting any of your opera music? Well, like the old timers used to do in the 1700s, 1800s?
The question is whether going back to rewriting of the old operas, and actually, I just did that, but not because the opera was defective, but because my perspective of history was defective. I've just gone back to rewrite Appomattox, which when it was performed in 2007, the Supreme Court had not taken the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act, which has happened, as you all know. We did not have voter suppression in 2000, at least we weren't aware of it 8 years ago. We're very aware of it now. And when I was asked to do the present Appomattox at the Kennedy Center, which will be there in a month, I said I'd like to do it, but I have to write a new second act. In the first version of it, you don't even have LBJ and Martin Luther King and George Wallace and Edgar Hoover and all these characters. In the new opera, in the new version, they are the second act. And what I was forced to do, really, I was forced to update the opera because we had missed that. We didn't know that was going to happen. We didn't know how far we were going to go to destroying what I think, did LBJ call it the Great Society? Was that the name for it? Yeah. And the safety net and what we've witnessed now is this kind of dismantling of our governance, which for some people think is a good idea. I just took a train across the country, and the car was 40 years old. I'm telling you, it's not a good idea. I wanted to see the country, and with my companion, we went to see it together. And it was great to see the country right straight across, New York to LA. But we got to places in the Midwest and in the West where the train had to go down to about 10 miles an hour because the tracks were in such bad shape. Because we don't believe in infrastructure anymore. You may have noticed that. But if you haven't noticed it because you're taking the trains, you're going to notice it. So this kind of thing that's going on. What I found, by the way, is that I didn't mean to bring political issues into the work. Then I did an opera about Gandhi, and what else could I do? I had stumbled upon his personality when I was in India in the 1960s, and there were people there that knew him, that I could meet them, and I came away deciding someday I would do something, and in 1981 I wrote an opera called Satyagraha. So that was the first opera that was overtly involved with, I wouldn't say politics, but I would say social change. Politics is a little bit different. Unfortunately, politics is not necessarily involved with social change. And I find that, here I'm doing this at Appomattox, and if I look at the works I've done since then, I have a lot of ideas of social change have entered into the work. I just could not avoid it. Eventually having children of my own and thinking about the world that they were living in, I'm sure everybody has had to think about that. What are we going to do? What are we doing for them that will make the world a place that would be livable, bearable in some way, which is, anyway, let's go to something else.
We'll have a question from this room.
I'd like to follow up on your comment that currently we are having a resurgence of creativity and productivity in music. I saw you at Sawdust a few weeks ago, and I was really impressed that you were being so supportive. What I'd like to know is, could you identify what you think are the most important developments in contemporary classical music?
So the most important developments in contemporary, it's a little bit hard to hear these questions up here, but the most important developments in contemporary classical music today.
Aside from your
most
own.
important, I'm not sure I know. I see scores which I have trouble reading, but other people have trouble reading them too. The Kronos Quartet, I went to a concert they did recently in which none of the music was presented in standard notation at all. And I thought to myself, wow, and it was a fantastic, beautiful concert of all young composers, beautiful. And I thought, how do other people play this music? Now what happens? How does another quartet play that? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Maybe another quartet has to do another iteration of it, which is quite different. Maybe the day when a score became a reproducible notation of a piece of music, maybe we're not going to be living in that world in the same way that we did. These things are changing rapidly, and I think I personally, I love hearing it. I love hearing things that don't sound like me, because who wants to be the last dance on the program? Nobody. You want to hear what the next dance is going to be. And I love hearing things that don't sound like me, because it gives me a tremendous feeling of optimism.
And then all the way in the back corner up here, house right, left, for the final question.
I really appreciate your thoughts and comments on artistry in America and how we don't have the support for it, but it's also, when you're an artist, it's kind of a rush and a great challenge. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, or if you're aware of, something that's prevalent now is crowdfunding. So if you have a piece of technology, or a play, or an opera, or an album that you want to make, a bunch of people can decide to participate in that in a democratized process almost, instead of, say, Theo Van Gogh being the reason the painting exists because he bought it, or the Pope was responsible for paying for the ceiling. Now it's a bunch of people who want art to happen are creating, and the artist says, I need help.
So the thoughts about crowdfunding, where an entire society is funding the art rather than just an individual or a small group.
Kickstarts.
Kickstarter, yeah.
Yeah. There have been there are very creative ways of funding things now. I've seen it even in works that I've been connected with, that where the monies weren't there and then they appeared in these ways. That's important, this way of non-traditional ways of funding things is super important, because the kind of people who need that money will not be able to get it from the places that are supposed to be doing it. And the reason is, and I'll tell you, I found out this very recently, if you go to a foundation and say, I have this project, they'll look and say, you know what, it doesn't fit our, what do they call it?
Their mission.
Yeah, it doesn't fit into the programs we have. And of course, nothing will fit into the programs they have. So basically, it's a waste of time to go to someone when they have an outline of what they're looking for, and they're trying to find the artist to fit it. But isn't that like making a pair of shoes and finding someone whose feet fit it, instead of saying, let me look at your feet and then I'll build you the shoe? I mean, isn't it a little backwards? But that is actually a way a lot of funding is done. The idea is that we know what we're looking for, and if you fit that, we can help you. Well, that's not going to happen. It may happen for some people, but for many people it won't happen. For the people for whom it doesn't happen, there is an alternative. And the kind of kickstarting we talked about, that's one way. The basic way, and the one way that will definitely work, is real independence. And it sounds hard, but in the funny way, it becomes the easiest thing to do, because then you just do everything yourself. You don't have to write an application. You get a job, you make enough money, you put together a show, you put on the show, you get another job, you make more money, you put on another show. Hey, that's a body of work can be made in that way, and in a way it has the virtue of being alive to the integrity and the authenticity of the person doing it, instead of trying to fit into someone else's idea about where your artwork is supposed to be. Personally, that's what we talk about all the day jobs, but look, everyone has day jobs. That's not new. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing heroic about that. There's nothing even interesting about it. It's just the way we do it here. But it also, is it a pathway to work? Yes, definitely. And I've seen that happen, and it depends how you define it. When I was just starting, and I was doing concerts on Sunday afternoons in my studio, if I had 30 people, I thought that was a good audience. And then it was 60. I thought that was a good audience. Then there was 500. I thought that was a good audience. I always thought it was a good audience. When I was a kid and learning to play the flute, I would go in the kitchen where my mother was cooking, and I would play the flute, and I thought that was a good audience. So I always had that idea that I needed somebody to listen. And then if that person was, then that was good enough for me. But I'm talking about something which someone could take away with them, and it sounds like it's not. These kinds of things are not at all impossible. They're more difficult now because the economics of our time do not favor people who do a full-time job and then do their work at night, which is what many people do. You can barely pay for your rent and your food with a full-time job these days, let alone have money to invest into the sound equipment you might need, or the paints you might need, or the theatrical stuff that goes with your play, or whatever it might be. But what I really like, and I'm saying, is that these material questions are urgent, and they're difficult, and they're there to be wrestled with in some way.